Jinjuri Jimblang, welcome friends. Ningari, Yugam language, Nagao, Karaba, Miab, Turubul, and Yagara people. Ningao, Karabu, Kanahan, and Nanahan. So welcome everyone, welcome friends. That was Yugam language, so my native language of the Yugambeh people or the Bunjalung nation. I'm a proud Wangarabarra Miaban or Aboriginal man. I just want to say a big thank you to everyone that's come along today. I'd like to acknowledge the country that everyone else is on. A lot of us are on Turrbal and Yuggera country today. And definitely with the new NAIDOC announcement for next year, and also just as we always do, I'd like to really acknowledge those elders that are past and present that have really started this fight for our cultural ways and our cultural safety to be reintegrated into a lot of the practices that we do. Today, we are lucky enough to have Tracy joining us, so thank you, Tracy. I'm sure she'll tell you a lot more about herself, but she's a proud Gamilaroi descendant and founder of Wattle Seed Nutrition, Health and Wellbeing, which is based on Gubbi or Cubby country, providing holistic care and culturally centered care to the community up those ways. Tracy is a freshwater woman, born and raised in Cooma country. She's a Haze practitioner, which is something that I'm very close to myself. And I recently or previously watched the last presentation when she was here, and it sort of sparked my interest. And I said to Eric, hey, we're going to get her back and she's going to come and do another one. And he tracked her down, and luckily enough, she agreed to come and do it, which has been quite a busy week, I think, for you, Tracy, with the IHA conference plus coming and talking with us. Just before I pass over to Tracy, we're just going to get a little bit of housekeeping out of the way. If you do have any questions throughout, please just pop them in the chat and we'll get to them when we can, probably at the end of the presentation. If everyone can stay on mute for the presentation itself, that would be great. As you've probably all heard from Zoom and its robotic voice, today's session is being recorded just for those who can't make it or for those that would like to go back and watch again. But again, a big shout out and a big thank you to you, Tracy. And I'll pass over to you to get started.
Thanks so much, Trent. I really appreciate it. And again, thank you so much, everyone, for waiting for me to pop on, and didn't want to cause you all a heart attack by coming in a little bit later than I intended. But I'm here and I'm actually really excited to be here, and it's really great to see you all joining today. So I'm just going to pop on and share on my screen and make sure I've got optimized for video clip. Share sound, that's right, isn't it? Yeah, okay. Let's get into that. So I've got a couple little videos in here as well. Can you see that?
Yep, put it on present,
excellent.
But it's all good, yep.
All good, fantastic. Thank you, Eric. So welcome everyone. Today we'll be doing one of my workshops where I sort of talk a lot about eating and living with deep listening and weaving culturally responsive and trauma integrated practice and Indigenous healing approaches into nutrition related care and practice, which you're all working in that sort of space with what you're doing. And it's an absolute privilege to be here. Before we begin, I'd like to also, oops, that's an old slide from someone. I put the wrong slide in there. But look, I'd like to acknowledge all traditional custodians of the land of which you're all gathered upon today, and also acknowledge the elders past, present from the nations of peoples across this country, and also those whose lands I'm presenting from today on the Gubbi and Cubby people's country here on Queensland's Sunshine Coast. Although it's not very sunny out there today, I think I brought the cloudy weather with me from Canberra. And you know, I'd like to acknowledge these elders because they are our ancestral and traditional ecological knowledge holders and original custodians of the lands and waters across this country we now know as Australia, using cultural practices for tens of thousands of years, working to sustain the health and well-being of people, country, plant and animal kin. And I extend deep respect to each of you who are joining today. So a bit about me, as you introduced, I'm a Gamilaroi woman of matrilineal line of descent. My totem is the emu, which is Dinawan in Gamilaroi language, and because I'm a matrilineal line of descent, it's Duldul. That's the female emu. I'm an accredited dietitian and an accredited nutritionist. My business is Wattle Seed Nutrition, so I work for myself, and I also am a licensed lead facilitator under We Are Lee's sovereign business model of Dardidi and culturally informed trauma integrated care practice and healing workshops. I've done a grad dip in Indigenous trauma recovery practices, as well as culturally integrated care practice and healing approaches, and also permaculture design certified. But most of all, I'm a mad lover of everything, our sovereign bush foods, food systems, and healing practices. And I also have a disclaimer that I don't speak on behalf of anyone else's foods or food cultures. I speak on what's open and publicly available. It's not appropriate for me to speak on anyone else's cultural food practices or laws, but I always encourage people when they attend my workshops to reach out to knowledge holders on the lands that you are living on and make connections with the foodways and food practices and the seasons and the environment that you're living on. So you can really honour those and really deeply connect to those countries and lands. It's really fun. I've been living on this land now for about nearly 17 years and have a wonderful relationship with many of the traditional custodians of this land and knowledge holders and aunties and uncles and cousins and brothers and sisters, etc. And I really value what they share with me, and it allows me to deeply connect and honour the lands that I'm living on today. So I just encourage people to do that because it really is a beautiful practice. A little disclaimer too, this presentation does include references to invasion and colonisation and dispossession. If you are triggered by any of that throughout this workshop, please, put your hand up or don't hesitate to step away and take a few breaths and regulate your nervous system. Reach out to your EAP if you need to afterwards, and yarning with your family or connection. But there's also some phone numbers there if you'd like to give anybody a call. And if you need to, I'm always here for a yarn as well. So just always like to put that disclaimer out there just to make sure that you are safe and that you're comfortable. So let's start by celebrating and remembering our beautiful ancestral ways of eating and living. Now, when I say ancestral, I tend to use this word instead of traditional, because traditional tends to infer that it's past and that these practices don't exist today, whereas they actually do. And despite colonisation trying to prevent many of these practices and knowledges existing today, they still do. And I always like to acknowledge that as well. So one of the things when I do my acknowledgements usually is I also like to acknowledge the fact that we are part of the oldest living culture in the world. And that is something that I'm incredibly proud of, and take that, consider it a responsibility to honour that in these days. So being that oldest living culture in the world, like we're the oldest living engineers, this is the Barwon fish traps, we're the oldest living sustainability experts, we're the oldest living agriculturists, if you read Bruce Pascoe's book, we're the oldest living, meteorologists, we know all about the stars and the constellations, environmentalists, I would say diplomats, when you look at trade routes that people would travel across to get from one place to another to be able to, go to things up on here, for example, the Bunya Nut Festival. We've got the Barwon fish trap food with people gathered there as well. So, you travel across lots of nations to get to these areas, and a lot of agreements and trade would happen across those places as well. So, there's a lot of diplomacy required in those times. Oldest living lawmakers with LORE as well, and also the oldest living scientists and oldest living nutritionists. I think about our beautiful, sovereign native foods, and the way that many of them have to be processed in order for us to be able to eat and enjoy them. And, you know, I think about that, like these days we have clinical trials and all these ethics that you have to go through, rightfully so, to be able to have these test what thing works and what doesn't. Whereas way back when, those foods and how it was meant to be done was discovered by trial and error. And I always acknowledge those who probably were the ones that end up getting crook sometimes from the processing, because, you know, and honouring those people to be able to retain that information despite colonisation, so that we don't get crook today. So I think that's pretty marvellous, and something that I'm really proud to see and acknowledge, that survivance and that resilience and resistance to colonisation, and for us to be able to enjoy those foods today and pass on to our children and our children's children, etc. So, as you know, now this is not my sort of slide. So I would use the word ancestral food systems. So because they still exist today, compared to what our current crops are now, and I can see Lisa's in here, so she'll probably be able to back me up on this. We've probably got 3 major crops in the world now that make up the majority of our food intake, and that's wheat, corn, and rice. Am I right with that, Lisa? Thumbs up. But it's basically, they make up the majority of our food intake. And when you think about that, as far as diversity in what nutrients and fibres and all those things that go into those crops compared to our ancestral crops, which still exist today, there's about, I believe it's 6,500 edible sovereign native plant trends. Okay, but you know, comparatively, our ancestral food systems and food crops are quite a lot more diverse, and they're actually more climate friendly and adaptable to the local food lands that they're located on. It's very holistic, and that's because there's that symbiotic relationship between humans and Mother Earth, because our survival relies on our Mother Earth survival and caring for it. So there's that reciprocity with care. There's social identity intertwined with that as well. You know, it comprises of hunting and gathering and harvesting and planting, etc. It speaks really deeply with culture and traditions and traditional knowledge systems, and it's very resilient and sustainable. That's been proven. And it's, as I said, it's adaptable to climate change as well. And I'll talk a bit more about why that is when we talk about our seasons. Just having a look here in the chat. I can't see the chat, so if anyone can see the chat, if you wanted to just read out the questions for me as they pop up, that'd be great. Thank you.
No problem, Tracy. So far, nothing. Just Lisa agreeing with you.
Cool. Thanks, Lisa. You know, and one of the reasons why it was sustainable too, or is sustainable in many areas, sustainable when you can access it too, is because food was only taken with what was needed and nothing was wasted. I remember speaking to an auntie when I was doing work up around the Rocky area, and she was talking about, you know, the porcupine and how it would be hunted, and then what meat and the oils that would be extracted from it and how would they be used for like healing, etc. But then when everything was taken, it would be planted back into Mother Earth again, where all those leftovers would go back into Mother Earth, and then they would use the quills for either ceremonies or tools, etc. So nothing was wasted, and only food that was needed was taken. And it was really rich in seeds and nuts and fruits and tubers, which are these plants that go underground as opposed to above ground, and really rich in lean meats like fish and poultry and eggs as well. And as I said, you know, we were talking about the seasons. This is just one calendar that's been made available. But if you look on CSIRO or Google just Aboriginal, you know, season calendars as well, you'll see that there's a lot of them around. But there's also a lot that aren't printed. So a lot of those knowledges are still shared orally as well. And that's something I think is pretty spectacular. So this is one from Gamilaroi season. So you can see that they are made up of more than just our usual main 4 seasons, right? And they're not depicted by a date on the calendar. They are depicted by what changes happen in the environment. So when you think about climate change, if there's changing in the climate that's happening naturally without, man-made causes, etc. If there are changes in the environment, say, for example, here on the coast, there's certain flowers that bloom at certain times of year, which mean that a certain type of fish will be available, or when you can go and gather crab, etc. And if they're not blooming because the change in the season has mean that they'll bloom at a different time, you won't gather those foods until those are blooming. So you are working with the changes in the environment as opposed to making the environment change for you and having that man-made intervention in place. So it's a lot more relational. And because of that as well, it means that you really have to be really finely tuned to those changes as well. So that's where I invite you to find out what those seasons are on the land you're in, and really pay attention to your environment and the changes in with that as well. And that also helps with deep listening and regulating the nervous system without even realizing it. So it's got lots of benefits with it. And I love this illustration because it perfectly illustrates how complex those relationships and all the interwoven stories are between us and our country and our land and our water. It's not just there to provide food for us and us to manipulate that. It's there because it represents the physical world, our law with L-O-R-E, our sacred world, our human world, our kinship systems, our family systems. Sacred sites are entwined with that as well. We've got plants and animals up here, and they're our kin. And caring for country, with punishments and penalties and stories. A lot of these stories about food and our environment, etc., are, told in pictures and dance and song and oral stories as well. And it's all about, keeping all of this together and keeping it cared for. So it sustains us. And I love this illustration. This is the Aboriginal social emotional wellbeing model that was created by Arnie Pat Dudgeon and brother Clifton Schultz and Hart and Kelly. So you'll see here, when I look with this model here, if you look this up, you actually get a breakdown of what each part of that. I'm a foodie, so I look at this and see a pie, right? So you'll see each part of that pie has a big explanation about each piece of the pie, which I won't go into today, but I invite you to look it up because it's quite a great and useful tool. But when I look at this piece of the pie, often, and I've worked with Stol and Jen, with people who are in correction centres and just people in general, sometimes a piece of the pie might not be as full as the others, right? But when you have, what happens is that you can draw strength and nourishment from other pieces of the pie while you're trying to fill up one of the pieces of the pie that isn't quite as full. And when I look at this and think about our sovereign bush foods, you can see that our bush foods and our food ways and our food systems can provide nourishment to every single piece of this pie in here. As you saw back in that other picture there before, food and our food systems and our food ways and our stories is steeped. It can help, strengthen our connection to our family and our kin, being plant and animal as well. Connecting to our community. We eat together, we talk together, we share stories about culture together. So it helps to connect to culture, helps us to connect to country and our spirit and our ancestors. And it also helps us to connect to our mind and emotions, which we're going to talk a bit about as well when we talk about gut-brain health and the impact that has on our overarching health and well-being. And it helps us connect to our body. When we think about the food and we eat our food and how it nourishes us, we can be more aware with how that food is fueling us. It helps us to reconnect with our body. And I love this quote here from Dr. Tamara McLean. To us, health is much more than simply not being sick. It's about getting a balance between physical and mental and cultural and spiritual health. And that health and well healing are interwoven which means that one can't be separated from the other. This is one of the reasons why I have spent the last 3 years really building up my skills and knowledge within the, culturally responsive trauma integrated care practice and healing space, because food and our health and well-being, to me, aren't separate. They're all part of. Has anyone got any questions I'd like to ask? If you do at any point, just pop it in the chat and I'll pause. I can't see the chat, but I'll rely on you, Trent, to let me know, and ask away.
Yep. Still nothing so far, but yeah, anyone, if they want to just pop it in there, and when Tracy has a little pause to catch her breath, then I'll ask the question.
Yeah, I yarn all day, but I like with these sessions for it to be two-way yarning, because I always end up learning something as well, because you are all knowledge holders, right? You've all got lived experiences. I'm sure each and every one of you have got some connection, some way, or some story you can share throughout this. So please share, because I love to learn as well. Don't be shame, be game. Okay, so as I said before, disclaimer, we're going to talk a bit, there's going to be mention and concepts about colonisation and colonialism as well, and its impact on our health and well-being. Now, this model isn't based here in Australia, but you can definitely see there are a lot of similarities, because Australia is relatively new when it comes to being colonised compared to other countries, right? So by the time they came to Australia, it was a really well-honed skill that they were able to impact quite effectively and efficiently, and it's still ongoing today. And we've all seen that, we're aware of that, right? It's just done a little bit more covertly. But, you can see here, like, colonisation had a massive impact on our foodways and food practices. People were displaced from their lands, or the lands were destroyed and other crops were placed in, or cattle came in, or other hard hooved animals came in and did damage to the topsoils, etc. That led to things like marginalisation, that is a determinant of our, socioeconomic determinants, and social employment and poverty. That can link to trauma, which then can lead to, relying on alcohol and other substances to cope with that, and domestic violence, all these impacts having here. So you can see here, I won't go into it too much, but this illustration quite clearly illustrates the impacts that colonisation has on our overarching nutrition quality and the way that we eat food and what we eat as well, which can then impact on things like just low birth weight, diabetes and hypertension and other health conditions that we're seeing. And mental health is one of our leading burdens of disease now in Australia. So, and this is all part of that. So when I look at you often, or you may have heard, the socio-ecological model and the rainbow and all these other determinants that, underlie our health and well-being today and what we're having to deal with. But what isn't really delved into a lot about is the impacts of colonisation and the trauma that has as well. And a lot of interventions are happening, or care practices are happening, without that consideration. And that can sometimes, evidence has actually shown, it can re-traumatize people, and it can actually exacerbate the problem as opposed to, assisting it. So it's really important for us to be aware of that. And so that we think about and rechange our thinking to being about, what's wrong with us, which we're always being told, to what's happened. And once you understand what's happened, you can then work through that and adopt lots of healing practices and our Indigenous healing practices for us to have strength to move forward. And also recognizing that resistance and that resilience that exists to give us strength to be able to navigate changes moving forward. So going from this heavy topic, I'm about to lead into one of my dad jokes. And if you've been to any of my workshops before, you've probably seen this, and I expect all your cameras go on and belly laughs to happen. So our ancestors' food looked like this. Cue the laughter. So thank you. But it really did look like this. It moved fast, right? So, and if you didn't move fast, a lot of the processes or gathering or the harvesting of the food was quite energy extensive. So have you seen any of the old photos of our old people? And they were ripped, man. Some of them had like 12 packs, and they were lean and tall and muscular. And, you know, because a lot of that was because of these lifestyles that were lived. We were very active, a lot of energy was used to gather food and process food and harvest food. Whereas today, our fast food looks more like this. And these days, you don't even have to get off the lounge. You can order an Uber or one of those places, and you're going to get it delivered straight to your door. So we're less active, and we're eating, you know, more foods like this. And that's not just mob, that's everybody, right? Nutritionally, this is a table, again, that I haven't created. I've taken it out of a paper by Leon O'Day. And so hence this name up here, you know, we know that it's not just hunter and gather, that we're also agricultural. But you can see with this table here, if from a nutritional profile, and this is just in one area, so it changed obviously in many areas depending on what food was available. But generally speaking, you know, the nutrition profile of our ancestral foods and lifestyles compared to contemporary foods and lifestyles is vastly different. And those ancestral foods are a lot more healthful because you're a lot more active, you're eating a lot more fiber. I think there's been some research there. I've seen a paper where they've indicated there's like being 33 grams of fiber eaten a day compared to what our recommended daily intakes are these days. Is around about 25, I think, that we have these days, and we're not meeting those. And that has impacts in our gut health. You know, we're eating more sugar, we're eating more saturated fats, and alcohol's now available, and we're eating more salt because of the foods that are available, or what we have access to, or what we're able to access as well. Food insecurity, we know, is an issue across all communities in Australia, and particularly in our remote communities. And look, this is an old table, and we know that in some remote communities it can be up around the 77%. So, you know, that is a big issue as well. Compared to ancestral, food was readily available. And I was talking at the IAHA conference recently with an auntie there who's from Wilcannia, and she was talking about how when COVID was happening, that community there were, you know, accessing those ancestral foods to be able to address the food insecurity that was a real issue happening at the time. And then the government intervention came in and stopped them from doing it, and actually shipped in food from another state to be able to address it on their terms. So that's quite disempowering. And I'm all about advocating for autonomy for people to be able to achieve their health and well-being in food ways as well. So speaking about autonomy is actually human need, and hunger and fullness is part of that. And food practices that match an individual's, families, or communities' unique situations and needs is also part of this. But as I just gave you an example, external pressures can actually impact and negatively on that autonomy. So I'm just going to show you a video. I've got an hour, haven't I? So I'm going to rattle my dags a bit. Actually, I might send this out because it's going to eat too much into my time. We'll come back to this at the end if we have time. If we don't have time, I will send it out to you in an email, Trent, to distribute to everybody if you like. Basically, I'll talk you through it, but it gives you like a video basically about what I've talked about the impacts of colonisation and that impact on our health and well-being, but that it's not hopeless, that we are still showing that resilience and resistance and survivance and thrivance that our ancestors have, but it just in innovative and different ways. And that's something to be held on to. I'll send out the picture I'll actually do this one because it's only a couple of minutes. Yes, I'll do that. And I won't talk because you're probably sick of listening to my voice now. I'm thinking about time. But when you're thinking about those impacts of colonisation, our food systems, and, you know, ongoing impacts of colonisation today, that has big impacts on our brain and that trauma. And that's trauma, right? Colonization and historical trauma is what that is all bundled up into. But it's not historical so much because it's still happening today. So this has big impacts on our brain and the way it works. So I'll show you this video so you don't have to listen to my voice, and it gives you an idea of those impacts it has in our brain. Can you hear that? Excellent.
The brain develops from the bottom up. The first thing to develop is the brainstem, or the reptilian brain as some people might call it. This area is responsible for our bodily functions. It tells us when to regulate our temperature, when to sleep, and when to eat. The next important part of our brains to develop is the limbic system, or what some people might call the mammalian part of the brain. The limbic system supports a variety of functions including emotion, behaviour, motivation, and long-term memory. The next part of the brain to develop is the cortex, which is the outer layer of the brain. This is sometimes considered the human part because humans are one of the only mammals that develop this part of the brain. This part of the brain is responsible for how we as humans were able to develop language, have thoughts, self-awareness, perception, and consciousness. Also, the cortex plays a key role in integrating the central nervous system and functions of memory. The last and most advanced part of the brain to develop is the prefrontal cortex, which is considered the executive functioning part of the brain. For some people, this part doesn't fully develop until they're in their mid to late 20s. The prefrontal cortex helps us to think through cause and effect, the ability to plan for the future, set goals, and understand the consequences of our actions. It's also responsible for the ability to moderate social behaviour. When we're in a stressful situation, part of our limbic system called the amygdala sets off an alarm bell response to let us know we're in danger and we need to do something about it. When this happens, the brain floods with a hormone called cortisol, so the body knows that something needs to be done. The most common responses to a stressful or dangerous situation are some you might be familiar with: fight, flight, freeze, or submit. This is an inbuilt system of survival to keep us safe when we're in danger. Like when our ancestors might have had to decide whether to stand their ground and fight against a large predator or run away. A stress response is a healthy, normal part of being a human. It lets us know that our bodies are working and keeping us safe. If a person is exposed to a highly stressful or traumatic event, or they have continual exposure to stressful events like abuse or neglect, their alarm system might become overactive. It might be always switched on, as if there was a risk of danger or threat at all times. For a child, this might affect how their brain develops. This is especially the case if it's in the context of stress or trauma events by a primary caregiver. In these cases, the child might develop an understanding of the world as an unsafe and dangerous place, even when they are in a safe situation. Sometimes this is called hypervigilance. It means being on edge or aware of danger at all times. Being exposed to stressful and traumatic events on a regular basis can also have a significant impact on neural connections in the memory center. It can even change the way we remember actual events. People use alcohol and other drugs for a variety of reasons. When someone's experienced trauma, they might be in a constant state of fight or flight, and so might use substances to help move them out of their stress response state. We also know that substance use can affect the way that our brain functions. Chemicals from substances cross the blood-brain barrier and can either stimulate or depress different parts of the central nervous system, affecting how the person feels, thinks, and acts. Similar to cortisol flooding the brain in the stress response, chemicals from alcohol and other drugs can also affect neural pathways and the way the person might make decisions or remember events. Luckily, neural pathways have the lifelong ability to form and change. You might have heard this referred to as neural plasticity. Through developing a better understanding of the brain and the way trauma and alcohol and other drugs affect neural pathways, clients can be better informed and empowered. This is an intervention itself called psychoeducation.
There you go. That's a really succinct way of talking about the impacts of trauma on what and how we do and process things and act. So I won't go into this too much for this slide here because we've gone through that already. But, you know, when you have trauma that's happened in your life. And when you think about historical trauma, that's something that we all have living within us at some point, and some people deal with it such different ways than others, you know. But what can happen is your amygdala, which is that alarm center, it can actually override your, your thinking brain and your emotional brain, because everything's based on survival. And this can actually have impacts on many things that will happen in the system, which I'll talk about soon. But when you look at like brain development, when you're going from a bubble as well, you know, a typical development is like survival is the smallest part, whereas the cognition and your emotional regulations, etc., make up the larger component of how your brain operates. Whereas when you've constantly got trauma or living with that as well, it's the other way around. So this has other impacts on the body, you know, with how we eat, what we eat, etc., and how we behave and respond to situations, including care that we receive from practitioners. So it's really good. This is why I talk about it's good to understand historical trauma and the impacts of trauma on our body, because it might help us understand why people might not engage in a certain way, or how they'll respond in a certain way in, you know, practice or in workshops or programs, but also ensuring that those practices or workshops and programs aren't going to re-trigger and make people feel unsafe. So it's quite complex, and everyone's different, like a fingerprint. Everyone processes it different, but we need to understand that so we can provide the best care that we have. That's why we call it trauma integrated. I can see a question there. Trent, does anyone want to ask me something there?
Amy had asked a question, just I think there's a question in there, but we'll just go through it. She
Okay.
said, I've recently been identified as an individual who has IBS. I cannot believe how informative this brain trauma video has been in my own mental health, linking with the digestive issues, and how informative. Thank you. On that state, I was going to say, for myself, I live with anxiety and PTSD, and that, you know, that looking for food and other sources that we tend to do when we're in these states because of the trauma or whatever it is that's triggered us can be really, really something that we all look for, and can really affect how we react to these normal situations.
Absolutely, Trent. And Amy, same. So full disclosure, I have general anxiety disorder, and I also have IBS. TMI, I know, but that we're all friends here. But, you know, it is a huge thing, and it does have physiological impacts on your body. And it's not your fault. This is just your body's way of reacting. But I think, you know, imagine being a person or a client or whatever who's coming in, and then something, without you being aware of this or having knowledge about this, they might respond in a way that, for some people, we've all heard, oh, they were violent, or they were this, or argumentative or something. It might be something else that's going on underneath, and we need to be in a place that if we're informed and be aware of ways to kind of help that person come back into a state of feeling calm and safe. We're not counsellors. That's not the point of being trauma informed. It's about being aware of what's happened and things that we can do to help support that person if they are having those responses. So thank you for that point as well. So as I said, you know, this can have stress and trauma caused from trauma, and stress overarchingly can have physical, mental, and emotional impacts. You know, it can impact on our blood pressure, our heart rate, sleep disorders, inflammation, headaches, because it has that big impact on our gut as well, right? You know, some people want to overwork or get hyperactive. Some people overeat, or they'll emotionally eat, or they'll reach for that food that, you know, isn't as nutritious for us. You know, but this is all part of this process and those coping mechanisms. It can be, you know, cause physical and physiological exhaustion and depression, and, as we said before, can cause real digestive issues. I think this is why when I was at uni, like the whole gut health thing was relatively new when I was coming out, and I was just so excited because it felt like, oh, I've got the answers, because I really related to it as well. And when we're talking about, you know, your nervous system and the way that the gut and the brain interact together, it's called the gut-brain axis. And those messages are carried through our vagus nerve, and we've got a parasympathetic nervous system and we've got our sympathetic nervous system. So the vagus nerve represents the main component of the sympathetic nervous system, which oversees a vast array of crucial bodily functions, including control of mood, immune response, digestion, and heart rate. It establishes one of the connections between the gut and the brain and sends information about the state of the inner organs to the brain. So this is just a little illustration here to sort of show you the different, like what, when the parasympathetic nerves are activated, it causes, these things to happen. So it's kind of like the rest and digest state that you want to sort of balance out. And then you've got your sympathetic nervous system. That's in that, you're going fast sort of state. So you don't want to always be in this state. And when you're feeling that constant stress or the stress that comes from trauma as well, you can imagine the impact that has on our overarching health and well-being. And we don't want to add to that. We want to alleviate that as health practitioners. So this is another great diagram here as well that shows you the how I was talking about before, the vagus nerve and the messages it sends up. So 80% of vagus nerve fibers send instructions from the stomach to the brain. So that has impacts on inflammation, our hunger and fullness hormones, and the way we metabolize food. And then we've got 20% of the nerve fibers sending instructions from the brain to the stomach. So that impacts on things such as your gastric acid and your digestive enzymes and your gastric capacity. So it has a big impact on that as well. And these can, disorders can result such as, major depression, PTSD, and also inflammatory gastrointestinal disorders such as ulcerative colitis, Crohn's disease, but also, which is not inflammatory, but irritable bowel syndrome is a real condition that is quite dramatically impacted by this as well. So this is just another, how am I going for time? All right, I'm going to have to rattle my tags. I'm happy to go over if anyone wants to hang on and keep it recorded for that as well. I could talk about this for days. Just ask anybody. I could get right on the train about it. So look, this is just another model as well. Like, we really want to be in this optimal state of well-being where there's balance between those nervous systems and our, everything in that piece of the pie that we talked in there before. It's all being full and with this utopia of balanced well-being that we all, would love to be in at all times. Realistically, we're all going to experience stress at some point, but it's that chronic stress that we want to try and get on top of so that it doesn't have those negative impacts and that we don't want to add to it as well. So, having a habitual stress reaction, we're talking about that brain neural pathways that happen, despite you might not actually be in that environment where you've got the saber-toothed tiger or saber-toothed wombat coming after you, you'll be, your body will respond like that because it's going to be perceived in that heightened or hypervigilant state all the time. And we don't want that. So we want to, because that leads to, chronic hyperarousal, self-destructive behavior, having breakdown. So what we can do is we want to be able to bring in those Indigenous healing practices like deep listening, being more present with our food, stepping out the country, yarning with people, whatever works for you and your practices. I have tea meditation. So it even goes to the point of me choosing my cup, bringing it down, sitting in front of the kettle, listening to the kettle boiling. No one has any idea what I'm doing, but it's just me giving my brain a chance to just concentrate on these processes to bring me back down again. Another thing is checking in with where your breath. So often, like take a moment now to see where your breath is. Is it shallow? Is it right down your stomach? Feeling that breath and breathing out and taking a big breath in and holding it for 4, and then breathing out for 4, and breathing in for 4, holding for 4, out for 4, holding for 4, and then in. Even that, having a moment, seeing where your shoulders are, observing that, and where your seat bones are. Just little things like that can help, all little tools to help bring you back into that mediated stress state. So you can actually start repaving those neural pathways again to help you have more healthful responses to those traumatic or stressful events. So when I think about this as well, like with Diabetes Australia, I talked about this at a presentation at the IHR conference as well. when we're thinking about how our parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous systems happen, we know it has a big impact on blood pressure, but it actually has an impact on our insulin uptake and the way that works as well. I won't go into the nitty-gritty of it, but if anyone wants to know more information about it, send me an email and I'm happy to have a yarn with her about it. But basically, what that has been linked to as well is that increased stress and prolonged stress has direct impacts about our waist circumference, right? And that has big impacts with risks. That's what we want to avoid, because we know that's a risk with diabetes, having that abdominal thickness that we have there as well. So regulating our nervous systems is also a big important way to be able to help navigate this. Now, this is the kicker, right? We have some of these interventions that happen are very focused on weight loss and restriction, etc., and are very measured by weights on the scale and very strict, etc. But does anyone feel relaxed in that sort of environment? I know I don't. So you're really creating more stress, which we know then goes around, has this impact as well. So we really want to be thinking about how we are doing these interventions and how we are measuring people's health. Are we measuring other aspects of our health as opposed to just what's on the scales? So having connection as well to our mother, to our community, to ourselves actually helps to stimulate vagus health as well. So community and belonging help you to feel safe and secure. When you are connected, you are calmer and more positive. So that's why one of the reasons I love doing group work so much is because within groups, we form a community where we have a collective similarity, and with similarity and solidarity comes strength and sharing and resilience, so we can be strong together and come up with solutions together. So never underestimate the power of community. And you're part in that as well, because you are part of that community. And you can also increase the health of your vagus nerve by having a healthy digestive system. When we're talking about our gut-brain axis and the messages that get sent from both, right? One of the things we have is we talk about mental health a lot. I argue that we should actually call it nervous system health because of that really strong connection between our nervous system and our gut and our brain. I call them the top brain and the bottom brain, right? So if we're taking all these, measures to look after our mental health, but we're actually not nourishing our bottom brain and keeping it healthy as well, we're not going to do as effective as a job. So they really need to be both looked at the same time, because healthy gut bacteria helps to create signaling molecules, which are communicated via the vagus nerve to the brain and help keep inflammation at bay, and also help with our mental health as well. And bacteria are also capable of creating neurotransmitters such as serotonin and dopamine, which are our happy hormones. And eating a wide variety of vegetables and fruits and grains and seeds can help provide probiotic fibers for bacteria to break down, which then provides them the essential fuel they need to maintain themselves and create they pass through and create, they eat and something has to come out the other side. Those are things that are called metabolites that positively influence brain function. Now, I know that not everybody can afford fresh fruit and vegetables. We've talked about that with food security as well. But even tinned vegetables, as long as you keep the eye on the back with salt, like your legumes and your beans and your lentils and things like that, adding it to some mince is going to increase that fiber content and fuel your gut health as well. Adding in, frozen vegetables. If you go and find that, don't go through the fridge, and if you've got the sad vegetables in there, don't throw them out, break them up and throw them in your food, or make a stock out of it as well. It all contributes to that. There's lots of little things we can do to sort of, fuel our bottom gut health. That's also going to keep us healthy up the top, but also provide us those key macronutrients like your fats and your carbohydrates and your proteins, etc. So come up with creative ways and work with your clients to find out ways you can work within what they've got available. So when we're talking about trauma and food restriction and also food insecurity, these can impact on our food behaviours. So it can lead to hoarding, like stress and anxiety around food, stealing food, only eating what's safe or known foods, compulsive or overeating as well. There's actually several papers directly linking historical trauma and ACEs, which we'll get into another time, and eating disorders. That's evidence is there for that. And then when you're thinking about restricting people and their foods, etc., that can also lead to disordered eating, the way that you obsess over a food, which is not going to fuel your health and it's going to cause more stress, which we want to avoid. And then you have food security trauma, which is associated with toxic stress and adverse long-term physical, emotional, and mental health outcomes. So we're working with clients and we see that's an issue, connecting them with social networks or what's their community networks, how are their kin supporting them, and really tapping into that and supporting them in that as well. So where are we now? Quite a topical topic. Lisa, bear with me on this one. So are weight and BMI the only way to measure our health? What do you guys think? Yay or nay? Considering everything we've just talked about as well. Cool. I'm not saying to rule them out. I'm just putting a full disclaimer about that, but I don't think they are the only way to measure our health. And in some instances, they can actually do more harm. And that's not just me saying it, that's backed by evidence. So that's a statement I'm sharing that's based on evidence. So when you're looking at BMI, not only is it based on a non-Indigenous population that we're meant to measure up to, it doesn't factor in like bone mass or muscle mass or genetics or pace or body fat or your diet and exercise. And the O words, when you think about historical trauma and the labels and the stereotypes and the stigmas that we're already having to deal with, and many of our clients are having to deal with, imagine having to also deal with the stigma of having these labels applied to them that are not appropriate. So BMI does not necessarily equal automatic health. This study here has shown that 1/3 of normal BMI patients were found to have had markers of cardiovascular disease, and half of the other O word BMI patients have no indicator of cardiovascular disease. So supporting your clients and advocating for them to, whether the advice that they're given is directly the first thing about weight loss, asking the person who's providing that advice, what advice would be giving to someone who lived in a smaller body, for example. When we thinking about things like that, I know there's a big spurt in bariatric surgery, having surgery done to achieve this ideal weight, etc. What other measures can be taken to measure, my health? How's my cholesterol levels? How's my how's my glucose levels? How's my heart rate? These are things to be considered as well, not just the weight on the scale. So then when I was talking about biases and stigmas and discriminations before, this is a diagram from the World Health Organization. Weight bias has negative attitudes and views about the O words and people with the O words. The stigma, labeling and stereotyping. You're lazy, you don't want to do this, it's your fault, it's a lifestyle choice, etc. It's not like we haven't heard that before. That's deeply rooted in society. And then you've got your weight-based discrimination. So you physical and verbal and relational abuse, and those subtle and overt actions as expressions. Many of them are already having to do that. We're dealing with that already. And then having this on top of that, imagine the trauma that it can be creating. And what can we do to help navigate that? As I was mentioning before, what other measures of health? How much further are we walking? How much better are we feeling in the other aspects of the pie? How are we feeling emotionally? How are we feeling connectedly?
I was just going to say on that, Tracy. So back when I was a clinical exercise physiologist, the youngest person I saw was a 6-year-old who was referred to me for weight loss. And I wrote the nastiest letter I think I've ever written to a health professional, simply because at the age of 6, they were active, they were happy, they were living a good life, they had no other health issues, but this individual had so you can imagine if you're getting stigmatized from that age to come and see professionals to talk about your weight, then that's going to end up potentially becoming a really lifelong issue for that individual. And that's really challenging for them. And that's the last thing that we want to see.
100%, Trent. when I used to work, when I first graduated, I worked at Aboriginal Medical Service and did outreach work in different areas. And I can't tell you how many kids were referred to me for that exact thing. And it broke my heart because those poor babies were listening to these conversations about them. And then they'd come to me and we would completely look at things a different way. But you could see the pain and the hurt and the trauma that is creating. And that's where we as health practitioners really need to advocate for our clients and talk to the people who are prescribing this and really educating them about the harm that it's causing. You know, there is more awareness, but we still have a long way to go. I don't do one-on-one work anymore. I do more of the group work, but you know, we really need to create more awareness. I have done workshops with doctors about this. So if you know any doctors who need any, I'm happy to have a yarn with them. I've got no shame with that whatsoever, and I certainly had some very animated conversations with number of doctors in this space when I was working in that environment. But it's heartbreaking, and that's not right, and it's going to have a lifelong impact on these babies and also our grown-ups as well. And that can withdraw from society. It has so many evidence-based impacts, which is all negative. So look, this is just another diagram. You know, it's weight stigma, the 5 unspoken truths. You know, you have this weight stigma, which causes stress, which increases eating, it increases cortisol, which we know already increases weight gain and thickness around our waist, which then go into other spirals. So, you know, we've seen health challenges out there, and we've seen some programs going out there, and it's based on how much weight the community has lost. I've recently done some training with some program managers in that space. They now are very, very aware of the impacts that can have. We've talked about before restriction and food restriction and the impact that has. So we really need to advocate and think about other ways that they can be measured with their health. Maybe it could be how far they stretch, how far they're working, a change in their cortisol, their cholesterol levels, you know, also how they're feeling emotionally and mentally as well. Oh, I won't share this one because I'm mindful of time. I'm already over, but I'll share this video with you. It's basically a poodle analogy of trying to make everybody fit into this, like the bulldog fitting into the size of the poodle, and then the bulldog's not meant to be that size, and they're starving and they're not working as well. So I'll send that out in an email as well. So looking at the fact that, you know, looking at food as not being a moral, not being good, bad, healthy, unhealthy, you know, moving judgment from the food, because if we're thinking, okay, I'm emotional, and you're like, oh, I'm going to be really naughty and have a piece of cake, you might eat the whole cake. But if you want to go, hey, I'm not feeling great, I know that piece of cake might make me feel good, and actually being really present and savouring each piece slowly, you can actually enjoy the piece of cake and then move on for it without guilt, without shame, because the guilt and the shame can then exacerbate and have that cycle happening again. And adopting a food neutral approach without having shame. We don't need to judge food. It's not good or bad. It has no moral value. And adopting positive language about our food, you know, instead of saying, oh, it's going to make you this or it's going to make you sick, etc., talking about how it keeps you strong, keeping your muscles working well, how it keeps your bones and your teeth strong, keeps your hair shiny and your healthy skin, you know, helps to heal quickly, helps you support you when you're sick, or, you know, support you from getting as sick as well. When we talk about our gut health and our immune system, it helps to support our immune function. And instead of using these words such as bad and healthy and unhealthy or clean or skinny or guilt-free, I shut up. Look, use words such as nourishing and energizing and satisfying, energy providing and nutrient rich and delicious, and it brings me joy and it's fun. Changing the language we have about food has a really powerful impact, especially for our little ones and our young people, because they listen and they observe. So I would like you to think about after this as well, like how food neutral do you feel? Where are you in your cycle, in that circle of health as well? How is each piece of the pie full? You know, practice this. This is experiential learning. This is Aboriginal ways of learning. You know, think about it, reflect on it, practice it yourself, because then you'll actually understand how you're impacting and the support that you're giving your clients as well, and seeing where they are. When we understand it, like professional development is personal development, right? So understanding yourself will help you support your clients and understand themselves as well. Do you frame food as being a reward or naughty or a treat, or is it just something you enjoy eating? And we talked about foods and having food deprivation. So this is a study as well. You know, cycles of food restriction can also lead to disordered eating behaviors, as I mentioned before, and unhealthy preoccupation with the food. I don't know about you guys. As soon as someone tells me I'm not allowed to do something, I want to do it. And I want to do it like next level. I'm not going to half do it. I'm going to do it. So some people have that with food. If you can't tell me to have that food, all I'm going to think about is that food and be unhealthy preoccupation with it. And sorry about my spelling mistake there, but it can actually have metabolic changes in our body that promote fat storage, which is all the worse when we combine that then with having the stress that's causing us to overeat. You know what I mean? So it's this vicious cycle that we need to hop off, this merry-go-round. We need to jump off it. So we need to reclaim autonomy of our food and nutrition and our health and well-being. And the ways we can do that is by revitalizing and honoring those ancestral ways of eating and living, being connected with our environment, being connected with ourselves and each other and our community and our culture and our kin. These are all ways that we can, you know, reconnect out and reclaim our autonomy. Take that strength-based approach, you know, build on the community assets and your individuals' assets, which is part of that community, and those strengths, those cultural knowledges and beliefs, you know, tap into the fact that we have long history of engagement and political activism, advocacy and research. You know, we talked about that. That's been with oldest living scientists, political diplomats, etc. You know, strengthen our culture and our social connectedness and shift away from what's wrong with us, what keeps us healthy, you know, what's happened to us, but then also what keeps us healthy. So it's a three-stage thing. They talk about trauma-informed care, about shifting it from what's wrong with us to what's happened to us, but then let's go to the next step and let's talk about what can then keep us healthy and happy. Practicing deep listening. So Auntie Miriam Rose, you know, that's Diddy is her word, her language for deep listening. You know, really practice that quiet, still awareness. Tune into your hunger. How you're feeling, if you are hungry, or is it because you're feeling emotional? What's going to work for you? What's going to work for your clients? And really tap into those changes in the environment as well, because that helps to regulate our nervous system when we tap into our mother. How am I doing? Shifting the focus from individual responsibility to empowerment. Instead of saying what they need to eat, to why do you eat what you eat? What is influencing? What's the underlying thing that's there? Is it trauma? How can we support you with working through that trauma and paving new neural pathways? Other support networks out there, can I refer you to a mental health practitioner or a social worker? And really tapping into our culture. That is one of our biggest strengths that we have as a people, and tapping into those cultural determinants. You've probably seen those, you know, self-determination, freedom from discrimination, freedom from assimilation and destruction of culture, protection from removal, relocation, connection to custodianship and utilisation of country and traditional lands, reclamation, revitalisation, preservation and promotion of language and cultural practices. We can do that with food and our food ways, and protecting that traditional knowledge and intellectual property, that Indigenous intellectual and cultural property as well. Understanding of law and traditional roles and responsibility. So one of the things I'd like you to take away is know who you're working with. Know yourselves as well. Practice there first. Understand where on the hierarchy you or your participants are and what they serve. Are they getting enough food? Is their food acceptable? Is it reliable? Is it good tasting? Is it novel? Is it instrumental? You know, are they getting enough food first before we then go over and say, well, you need to be eating something that's been plucked under a full moon at midnight? You know, we have to look at what's available and not put those added stresses or stereotypes or healthism or moral value on these foods. Are they learning are they in a learning brain or in a survival brain? Have they got the capacity to take on what we're sharing with them? You know, when we're talking about that survival brain, is it overriding things? We need to work on things that can help with that first, in the nervous system first, before we go into those other areas. And what boundaries need to be put in place for safety for that client and for yourself? What needs are being met? So we've talked about here is we've got all the other needs, but also I always add in there our cultural needs. What needs have been met? What cultural determinants are being met? And I'll leave these here, but understanding and recognizing, respecting and drawing upon the strengths of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultures, bush foods, food practices, and traditional ecological knowledges. Tap into who you know. Here's some text here as well, which I'll send out. You know, understanding trauma, adopting culturally integrated trauma-informed care. I run workshops in that. If you want to do that next year, give me a call. You know, understand your strength-based languages, your cultural determinants. Eat with the seasons. Reduce your plate waste and your food waste. These are all ways we can replicate our ancestral ways in modern times, no matter where we are. And that's me. I know I'm over, but I've done remarkably well. I could talk about this for days.
So could I. I literally have an A4 piece of paper of things that I was going to potentially have a discussion with. So maybe we'll have to get you back again, Tracy, and actually have a discussion about it.
I can stay on if anyone wants me to answer any questions. It's completely up to you. I'm happy to.
Yeah. If people have questions, we're more than happy to stay on. I was just going to touch on the language side of things, Tracy. You mentioned that obviously you've been doing a lot of work in changing your language. I know I did the same and I still do to this day, when discussing, people living with diabetes, or originally it started with persistent pain for me and reframing the way that we spoke about what people were managing or living with. Is there some of your go-tos that you use when talking to individuals around food and language in that sense?
My first thing is, like, when I first get to know people, or in groups as well, I always ask, like, where are you now? Like, what is it that I can help you with? And if the people are coming in like, oh gosh, people come in, I always do it because they think I'm a dietitian on weight loss, and I'm so far from that. But, people always come in with that because it's a preconception. I'm like, what is motivating you to do that? And 9 times out of 10, it's because XYZ told them they had to be that. So like, well, what else keeps you healthy? Like, where are you moving? And what are you doing at the moment? And because people feel shame about if they've got food insecurity, people feel shame about that, especially if they've got kids. And it's tapping into going, well, what are you doing at the moment? Wow, how great that you've come up with that way of being able to do that. You've got that strength to do that. You've got that resilience in there. Using that resilience, what are other things that we can do that you want to change? How can we do that? What support networks have you got around you? I always look at the strengths, because people are told over and over and over again that we're less than, that we're problems, and it overrides the fact that we've already got these strengths here. So I always tap into those strengths first and foremost, and let people tell me what their strengths are. And I acknowledge those. Oh, wow, it sounds you've done really well with that. Let's talk about how we can utilize that in this area that you've talked to, something you want to work on. Does that help?
Yeah, no, definitely. I think that's something that's really important, is, as you said, focusing on someone's individual strengths and going through. I used to do the same thing. I'm an exercise physiologist, so people would come in for exercise and weight loss. 9 times out of 10, it had nothing to do with that individual. It was just someone had told them that they needed to lose weight. I was actually doing some diabetes education stuff just this week, and then a gentleman had come into the room, and he was placed, or they wanted to place him on Ozempic, because we all know Ozempic has this great weight loss potential. But he was happier, healthier, and he felt so good in his own ability because he was managing all of his other diseases that he was living with. And he was happier than he'd ever been, and he was more active than he'd ever been. So to me, I was like, well, weight loss isn't even on my radar at this point in time, because you're happy, you're healthy, you're doing everything right. Just keep doing what you're doing. And I think that's where language is so important. The other thing you touched on, which I absolutely love, and we try and talk about it as much as we can when it comes, in Diabetes Australia even. I know Eric and I are big proponents of it, and that's identifying the underlying reason as to why people are looking for certain foods. They're looking for whatever it might be that's their coping mechanism at that point in time, alcohol, drugs, other things like that. And it's identifying what is causing that. And if we don't identify that underlying issue, then we're never actually treating the cause. It's sort of 100%. Like going, you're drinking 10 litres of Coke, so here's 10 litres of Pepsi Max. Great, we're changing a few things, but the underlying condition as to why that person's looking for that sweetener is still there. And that's something that I think culture, and something that we've seen and we've really integrated into a lot of our programs, is that culture is so important, and that reintegration people being told not to eat turtle and dugong because it's fatty, but that turtle and dugong is such a connection to their country. And if they lose that connection, then they're losing a lot of their culture that they've lived in for years.
Yeah, which we know is a protective factor. Culture is our protective factor. That's our biggest protective factor. I was just about to say something there when you said that too. Oh gosh, my brain's just gone blank now. I can't remember what I was going to say. It was something that was going up. So one of the things too, when you're trying to unpack, you know, you've identified that perhaps there's something that's underlying there. When we're thinking about the brain and the reptilian brain overriding that thinking or emotional brain, sometimes people can't actually articulate it because that survival brain is overriding everything. So when I think about and I talk about this in my trauma workshops, when we look about our Indigenous healing practices, using other tools. So if it's within your scope and you feel comfortable to, if they don't want to talk about it, maybe they want to draw about it. You know, if you've got the room to do that, maybe they want to draw about it. Think about how your office is set up. Is it set up so you've got things around that people can play with, or, you know, that kinetic sand, or having a drawing pad there and some Posca pens, even something as simple as that on the desk. You know, I do it. Like when I'm drawing something, I'll be drawing while I'm thinking about things, and, you know, it helps me think about things and get things out. Some people might want to write about it. You know, it's just having those little things available. If they can't articulate it, they might want to draw about it.
Exactly. I used to use a lot of drawings, which is, again, it comes. I think a lot of the practices and trauma-informed practice comes a lot back to these psychological values. I'm lucky enough to have some psychological training and understand a lot of the human brain and the reptilian brain, and the way that it overrides or can be overridden by these constant states of high emotions.
Yeah.
And it's just so interesting. But, you know, for years in psychology, they've been drawing, they've been writing, they've been using all these other practices. But in allied health, we just, you know, everyone believes, you know, the dietitian gives you a piece of paper that says, can you eat A, B, C, and D? And the exercise physiologist goes, can you do A, B, C, and D? And then they're going to be healthy and have their happy fix. But it's so much more complicated than that. And I love that trauma-informed practices are really making their way into the mainstream.
Yeah, 100%. And it's very powerful, and it's such a good tool to have as practitioners, because that just is going to support our clients just on another level.
Definitely. Yep. Eric, did you want to quickly put up that evaluation slide?
Will do.
I can't see any more questions coming through in the chat. Tracy said, like I said, we could probably spend the rest of the day talking about this stuff until we're blue in the face. Because I absolutely love it. Like, it was a big thing. It's something that I've really tried to bring to Diabetes Australia when I joined over a year ago, and it's something that I can see the space is moving in that beautiful direction where we're starting to actually talk about these cultural aspects and these concepts and looking at people in more than just a visual sense. And that's something that hopefully continues to occur. But I'd just like to say a big, massive shout out to Tracy for coming along today and doing the presentation. Like, the comments, I don't know if you've had a chance to see the chat.
Yeah, I have. And with the slides, I'm happy to send out the slides. I'd ask that they don't get shared around, because this is actually part of a larger workshop that in the process of designing. I'm actually designing a workshop called Culturally Responsive Trauma Integrated Nutrition. So these are some of the slides from that, so you guys get a little preview, which is great. So give me feedback, because I'd like to hear some feedback. This is just a little window. There'll be 3-day workshops, but this is just a little window into some of the things we discuss in those workshops. So happy to send out the slides for you to have a look at. And I'll send you the emails. I'll send you an email with the links to those videos as well.
Yeah, perfect. That would be amazing. Miranda asked, any further training at the moment that you've got on this kind of stuff, Tracy?
Yeah, well, I run culturally informed trauma integrated care workshops where because I'm running it, we go a bit of a deeper dive about the impacts of trauma on our physical self. So you just got a real quick little snapshot of the impact it has in our body, but I kind of unpack it in a bigger way and also talk about the different types of trauma. And then you spend 2 days of actually working on you know, we talk about our own individual stories. It's experiential learning, it's Aboriginal ways of learning, it's strength-based, but we actually practice on ourselves how we would be informed with others. So we learn about our individual story and our little group stories, but then where that sits within the collective story and how we can utilize and build upon communities of care and communities of practice. So yes, I do training in that. So I think it's a minimum of 25 people. So if you want to do that, happy to do that.
Yep. In saying that, I guess I got to spruik what we do. So we obviously do diabetes yarning workshops as well, which follow a lot of the same concepts that Tracy's talked about today, that trauma-informed care, that intergenerational trauma, social determinants of health, and how that relates to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people living with diabetes. So you can always get in touch with us, and we're more than happy to come along with that. And who knows, maybe we can get Tracy to write a resource with us in the future about something to do with nutrition, because that would be pretty deadly.
Yeah, it would be. And so thank you for bringing up my website. So if you go into my website, there's a connect page at the back. It actually gives you little check boxes of the things if you're interested in them. And if you hit the subscribe, I'll keep you in line with the, send out a newsletter with my upcoming workshops as well, because I'll be running a few next year.
Yeah, perfect,
and
Tracy. Again,
it'd be great to do a resource with you, Trent. I'd love that.
No, I think we're going to have to line that one up, Eric. Don't you think? But yeah, again, thank you so much for your time today. We really do appreciate it. Thank you to everyone who was able to come along and join in on the discussion. And like I said, hopefully there'll be many more to come out of this. And keep an eye out for the recording, because it's always good to go back and revisit a lot of the concepts that we've talked about today. So thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Lovely to have you all join as well.